Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing okay. This is our second video on the ascending or the sensory spinal pathways. As part of the video 1, we already discussed the hierarchical arrangement of the neurons within the sensory pathways. We said that every sensory pathway more or less has a first order neuron, a second order neuron, and a third order neuron. Then in video 1, we discussed the type of sensory information which is conveyed by the different sensory tracts, such as the dorsal column, the spinothalamic pain temperature pathway, and the spinocerebellar pathway. We also highlighted the location of the first order neuron and its dorsal root ganglion, and we identified the different tracts in a transverse section of the spinal cord. Now we're going to take that information one step further, and as part of the video 2, we'll be taking up those tracts in much more detail. We'll be talking about the dorsal column medial leminiscal pathway in this video too, and we'll also highlight the clinical deficits which could result by lesions along the course of this pathway. So now let's start covering the major sensory tracts one by one. And as part of this video, let's talk in detail about the dorsal column medial leminiscal pathway. Right, so as mentioned already, the dorsal column is dedicated to bringing in the sensory information of vibration, proprioception, and two-point discrimination from the peripheral parts of the body and takes it up to the higher neuronal centers inside the central nervous system. Like many other sensory pathways, there is a first order neuron, second order neuron, and third order neuron inside the dorsal column pathway as well. The first order neuron of the dorsal column pathway, like other sensory pathways as well, is situated inside the spinal nerve. So it's part of the peripheral nervous system. Its cell body is situated inside the dorsal root ganglion, which is also part of the peripheral nervous system because ganglion is an accumulation of neuronal cell bodies which is outside the CNS. The dendrites of the first order neuron, they bring in the sensory information from the peripheral body receptor, the sensory information pertaining to vibration, proprioception, and two-point discrimination. From the cell body onwards, you can see the axons are then going to take in that sensory information through the posterior root into the posterior sensory horn of the spinal cord. Now, most of the spinal pathways, they have their second order neuronal cell bodies situated inside the dorsal sensory horn or the posterior sensory horn of the spinal cord. And hence the first order neurons for most of these pathways are then going to synapse with the cell bodies of the second order neurons inside the posterior sensory horn. The second order neurons then ascend in the white matter columns, which are situated over here all around the butterfly-shaped gray matter of the spinal cord. You can see different white matter tracts over here, and we'll talk about them as part of the different sensory pathways. However, the situation is a little bit different over here in case of the posterior column or the dorsal column pathway. The axons of the first order neurons, once they enter into the posterior sensory horn of the spinal cord and bring in that information of vibration, proprioception, and two-point discrimination, these first order neurons, they do not synapse over here in the posterior sensory horn. Hence, the second order neuronal cell bodies are not situated inside the posterior horn. So the first order neurons, they basically ascend up in the posterior white column and they ascend all the way up to the caudal medulla where the second order neuronal cell bodies are present. Now, as the first order neurons ascend inside the posterior white column, part of those neurons ascend in the medial half of the dorsal column. That medial half is known as the fasciculus gracilis. The fasciculus gracilis conveys the information of vibration, proprioception, and two-point discrimination from the lower half of the body, basically from the T6 spinal segment and down below, whereas the lateral part of the posterior white column, that is known as fasciculus cuneatus, and the first order neurons traveling through the fasciculus cuneatus, they carry the same information of vibration, proprioception, and two-point discrimination from the upper half of the body or from the T6 spinal segment and above. You might be wondering, what is a fasciculus? Fasciculus is basically a collection or a bundle of neurons which is situated within the central nervous system. Whenever there is an accumulation of the neurons inside the central nervous system, we call it either a fasciculus or a tract, whereas if the same accumulation of the neurons is situated inside the peripheral nervous system, then it is referred to as a nerve. Now, the second order neuronal cell bodies are the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus, which are present in the caudal medulla. So the first order neurons running inside the fasciculus gracilis, they are going to ascend up to the caudal medulla, where they will synapse with the second order neuronal cell bodies called the nucleus gracilis in the lower part of the medulla. The fasciculus cuneatus, the first order neurons traveling in the fasciculus cuneatus, they will then synapse with the cell bodies of second order neurons inside the caudal medulla, known as the nucleus cuneatus. Both the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus are receiving the same information. The only difference is that the nucleus gracilis receives the information about the vibration proprioception and two-point discrimination from the lower half of the body, and the nucleus cuneatus receives the same information from the upper half of the body. Now, the thing which you have to know over here is that as the sensory neurons, they pass through the posterior sensory horn of the spinal cord and then eventually ascend up in the dorsal column. What they actually do is that they send a small neuronal branch to a group of neuronal cell bodies over here, which is known as the nucleus proprius. Nucleus refers to an accumulation of neuronal cell bodies in the posterior gray horn, and this accumulation of cell bodies over here is known as the nucleus proprius. So nucleus proprius is part of the dorsal column pathway. However, it is not the mainstream neuron in this pathway. What I mean to say is that it is not the second order neuronal cell body, which is actually the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus. However, the nucleus proprius inside the posterior horn does receive a neuronal connection from the first order neuron. Hence, it is a part of the dorsal column pathway. Now, the ascending first order neurons in the dorsal column of the spinal cord, they continue to ascend dorsally in the caudal medulla. Now, what you can see over here is basically a midline sagittal section which has been taken through the cerebral hemisphere. So what you're looking over here is basically the medial surface of the left cerebral hemispheres. You can see the frontal lobe in the front over here, and the back end of the brain over here is characterized by the occipital lobes and the cerebellum at the back. The green dotted line over here represents a pathway which is going to be taken by the dorsal column, medial leminiscal pathway. And you can see over here that the dorsal column is dorsally situated in the spinal cord and inside the lower medulla, but then it crosses somewhere over here and kind of comes to the ventral part of the medulla. And then from here onwards in the upper medulla and in the brainstem, it is more ventrally situated structure. Now, the ascending first order neurons then synapse with the cell bodies of the second order neurons inside the nucleus gracilis and inside the nucleus cuneatus. So, the first order neurons of the dorsal column, which are ascending in the fasciculus gracilis, they synapse with the nucleus gracilis medially, which is more medially situated, and the first order neurons which are ascending in the fasciculus cuneatus, which is more laterally situated, they synapse with the cell bodies inside the nucleus cuneatus. Now, if you take a horizontal slice over here in the lower medulla oblongata, then the horizontal slice looks somewhat like this over here. So what you can see over here is a section of the lower medulla. You can see the pyramids in the front, and remember, pyramids were the elevations created because of the underlying corticospinal tract fibers, which were more ventrally situated before they crossed over to become the lateral corticospinal tract. This would be the ventral aspect, therefore, of the section. At the back end over here, we can see the fasciculus cuneatus and fasciculus gracilis, which are surrounding the nucleus gracilis, which is a more medially situated structure, and the nucleus cuneatus, which is more laterally situated. These are actually the cell bodies of the second order neurons in the dorsal column medial leminiscal pathway. Next comes the internal arcuate fibers. Now, if you look at the same section over here, you can see now that the second order neurons are popping out from the cell bodies of the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. These second order neurons then project anteriorly from the nucleus gracilis and from the nucleus cuneatus. The fibers run in a horizontal plane. They're moving anteriorly in a horizontal plane and then decussate with each other as they come to lie more ventrally just behind the pyramids. Then these decussating fibers are known as the internal arcuate fibers, and then from here onwards the dorsal column is now a more ventrally situated structure. It is then going to ascend behind the pyramids as medial lemniscus. Now, if we look at the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, where this dotted line represents the dorsal column pathway, what you can see over here is that the dorsal column was more posteriorly situated structure inside the spinal cord as well as in the lower medulla, but then it crossed over, and when it crossed over, it became ventrally situated. These fibers, as they move anteriorly, they form what are known as the internal arcuate fibers. The internal arcuate fibers from here onwards then ascend up as the medial leminiscus, and so now from here onwards, from the upper medulla onwards, the dorsal column becomes a more ventrally situated structure. Now that the internal arcuate fibers have moved ventrally behind the pyramids, these are then going to ascend up behind the pyramids as the medial lemniscus. Now, the term lemniscus basically refers to the bundle of the nerve fibers within the central nervous system, just like we refer to a bundle of nerve fiber as a fasciculus or a tract. Now, once again, we're looking at a medial surface of cerebral hemisphere. The dotted line over here once again represents the trajectory of the dorsal column pathway. Now we've actually seen that the internal arcuate fibers have moved more anteriorly, and now the dorsal column is progressing. The dorsal column is now ascending upwards as the medial lemniscus. Hence, if we take a section over here from the upper medulla oblongata, where we are above the level of the internal arcuate fibers, then the section looks somewhat like this. Now, see, this is a horizontal slice taken through the upper medulla oblongata. You can see the fourth ventricle at the back, so this would be the posterior aspect of the horizontal slice. Anteriorly, you can see the pyramids over here where the corticospinal tract would be running, which is a more ventrally situated structure in the upper medulla, and hence so this would be the anterior aspect of the slice. And you can see that right behind the pyramids, we can see some green color-coded region over here, which is the area where the medial lemniscus or the dorsal column pathway is now ascending. Remember, the dorsal column has moved more anteriorly now. It is not a posterior situated structure as it was. It's not a posteriorly situated structure anymore as it was in the spinal cord and in the lower medulla before the decussation. Some other structures which you can see in this slice over here is this crumpled nucleus over here, which is basically the inferior olivary nucleus. It's part of the motor system, and we'll talk about this maybe in context of the voluntary control of the motor activity in some subsequent video. This nucleus creates an elevation over here, which is known as the olive, which is laterally situated to this elevation, which is the pyramid. And these are some of the gross anatomical features which are macroscopically visible on the prosections of the human brain. Now, on the right over here, you can see another horizontal slice taken through the prosection of the brain as this illustration. This is a Mulligan stain section of the human brain. So anything which is gray or anything which is gray matter is going to appear blue in color. Anything which is white matter will just remain white. So what you can see over here is this crumpled nucleus over here, which is a gray matter structure, and hence it has been stained blue. This is the inferior olivary nucleus. You can see the elevation, the olive over here very nicely. Medial to it, more anteriorly situated structure. The more anteriorly situated is this pyramid over here, where the corticospinal tract fibers would be descending. Behind the pyramids, we can once again see the region where the medial lemniscus would be situated. And at the back over here, you can see this space over here, which is the fourth ventricle, and hence that tells you that this is the posterior aspect of the horizontal slice. If you go further backwards over here, this is the area where the cerebellum is going to be situated, and you can see part of the cerebellum visible over here in this horizontal slice. Next, the medial lemniscus continues to ascend in the ventral pons. Now, once again, the trajectory of the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway is shown by this green dotted line over here. You can see that now the medial lemniscus is passing through this part of the brainstem. This bumpy region is known as the pons, and it is now a much more ventrally situated structure. If you take a horizontal slice through the pons, then the section of the pons looks somewhat like this. Now here, this is the anterior aspect of the section of the pons, which is characterized by these horizontally running, transversely running fibers, which are known as the pontocerebellar fibers. This is part of the cortico-pontocerebellar system, and you can see the corticospinal tract fibers traversing through the horizontal pontocerebellar fibers. Right behind the pontocerebellar fibers, and right behind the corticospinal tract you can see this green color coded region here. This is where the medial leminiscus is going to be ascending behind the corticospinal tract, and you can see once again it's a much more ventrally situated structure. Right behind over here you can see this space which is the fourth ventricle, which basically tells you that this is the posterior aspect of the horizontal slice of the pons. Now if you look at the pro section of the pons over here, uh, you can see these horizontally running transverse pontocerebellar fibers very clearly, and this is actually one of the hallmark feature of the pons, with the help of which we can actually identify the section of the pons when we look at a prosection of the brain. Right behind the pontocerebellar fiber, this is the region where the medial leminiscus would be ascending. This is once again a mulligan stained section, so therefore all these white matter tract fibers are appearing white. Anything which is gray matter is going to be appearing blue, and that's why we don't see much of the blue staining over here. Now the medial lemniscus then ascends from the pons in the ventrolateral region of the midbrain. Right, so once again, we're looking at this dotted line representing the trajectory of the dorsal column medial leminiscal pathway. If we take a slice over here through this region, which is known as the midbrain, then we can see that the horizontal slice of the midbrain looks somewhat like this. What you can see over here is the ventral aspect of the midbrain. Here, the ventral aspect is characterized by these two rabbit ear-like structures, which are the crura or the peduncles of the midbrain. And so consequently, this space over here in between the two peduncles is called the interpeduncular fossa. Now the midbrain, generally speaking, can be divided into three subregions. For that, we need two anatomical landmarks. This region over here is known as substantia nigra, and it's usually dark and it's usually black in color because of the melanin pigmentation. And then this little space over here represents the cerebral aqueduct, which is part of the ventricular system of the brain. Now, the region of the midbrain, which is behind the aqueduct, is known as the tectum, and we'll talk about that in detail in some subsequent lecture on the brainstem anatomy. Now, the region between the cerebral aqueduct and substantia nigra is known as the tegmentum, and then the region in front of the substantia nigra is the crus or the peduncle of the midbrain. Now, the medial lemniscus can be seen situated in the tegmental region of the midbrain, and it is now a much more ventrolaterally situated structure. This is once again a mulligan stained section of the midbrain. You can see the substantia nigra over here very clearly. Anterior to it, this is the peduncle or the crus of the midbrain, one on either side. And then you can see the cerebral aqueduct at the back, this little space over here. And this region here is known as the tegmentum. And you can see the medial lemniscus here in the ventrolateral region of the midbrain. Right, so now the medial lemniscus continues to ascend and eventually reaches in a region which is known as the thalamus. Right, so once again, we're looking at the medial surface of cerebral hemisphere. We can see the dotted line, which represents the trajectory of the dorsal column-medial leminiscal pathway. And now the medial leminiscus is going, and now the second order neurons inside the dorsal column-medial leminiscal pathway, they are going to reach the thalamus, where they will synapse with the cell bodies of the third order neurons, which are situated inside the thalamus. Now, every sensory information has to relay at some point inside the thalamus, although there's an exception. The sense of smell does not relay inside the thalamus, but apart from that, every sensory information has to relay inside the thalamus, and so therefore the dorsal column has to relay its information of vibration, proprioception, and two-point discrimination into the thalamus as well, in a nucleus which is known as the VPL nucleus of the thalamus, and that is what's going to happen over here. Now, if we take a horizontal slice through this region over here where the thalamus is situated, and the horizontal slice of the thalamus looks somewhat like this. You can see the horizontal slice shown in this illustration here, and you can see that the thalamus is a much more medially situated structure. So this is a medial aspect of the slice. This is the lateral aspect where you can see the basal nuclei, the lentiform nucleus, and together the thalamus and the lentiform nucleus are sandwiching this V-shaped white matter tract fiber region, which is known as the internal capsule. Now, the medial lemniscus, which contains the second order neurons of the dorsal column medial leminiscal pathway, they will synapse with the cell bodies inside the thalamus. Those cell bodies are known as the VPL nucleus or the ventral posterior lateral nucleus. All the sensory information taken by all the sensory tracts from the body, they are going to always enter into the VPL nucleus of the thalamus. And the reason why I'm stressing upon that is because there's another nucleus inside the thalamus which is known as the VPM nucleus, the ventral posterior medial nucleus. And all the sensory information from the face region, that actually relays in the thalamus in the VPM nucleus. So that's the difference between the two nuclei, the VPL and the VPM. But the bottom line is that all the sensory information, with exception of the sense of smell, has to relay inside the thalamus before it gets projected through the third order neurons to the cerebral cortex, where the conscious perception of that sensory information begins to happen. Now this is a horizontal slice taken through a prosection of the brain, and you can once again see the internal capsule over here, which is a V-shaped structure. This is the posterior limb of internal capsule, the anterior limb being over here. This is the angle or the genu, and you can see the internal capsule being surrounded by the lentiform nucleus more laterally and the thalamus more medially. This bumpy region over here, and we'll talk about that sometime later, this bumpy region here represents the caudate nucleus. It is in fact the head of the caudate nucleus, which is also part of the basal nuclei, but we'll talk about that in a separate video on the basal system. Lastly, the information then gets relayed through the third order neurons. It gets projected onto the cerebral cortex. Now, although we're talking about the dorsal column pathway right now, but later on when we talk about the spinal thalamic pathway, then this information applies onto that pathway as well. So it doesn't matter if you're talking about the dorsal column pathway taking vibration, proprioception, and two-point discrimination information from the lower part of the body, or we're talking about the spinal thalamic pathway bringing in the information of pain and temperature. All the sensory information is going to be relayed inside the VPL nucleus of the thalamus, and from there the third order neurons then project on to the cerebral cortex in the primary sensory area. This is the lateral view or the superlateral view of the left cerebral hemisphere, and here you can see the medial view of the left cerebral hemisphere. You can see three prominent sulci over here. This one in the center is the central sulcus. In front of it, this is the precentral sulcus, and then behind it, this is the post-central sulcus. This region over here between the central sulcus and the post-central sulcus is known as the post-central gyrus. This is the primary sensory area, and you can see all the sensory information from the VPL nucleus of the thalamus is then going to be relayed through is then going to be projected through the thalamocortical projections, which are the third order neurons. That information is going to be projected onto the primary sensory cortex. The primary sensory cortex also extends onto the medial side of the brain, and you can see this little extension of the primary sensory cortex on the medial surface in a region which is known as the paracentral lobule. Now, in the cerebral cortex, the conscious perception of the sensory information is then going to happen. That sensory information would then be carried over to the higher order association areas, including the secondary sensory areas, and then the higher order tertiary association areas. Now, since we have talked about the primary sensory cortex, so how about if we talk about something which is known as the homunculus? Well, what is a homunculus? Or in other words, what is a sensory homunculus? Now, why are we talking about the homunculus? Does knowing about the sensory or the motor homunculus has got any clinical significance to it? Well, yes, it is important to know this sequential representation of our body parts. It's been in context of the blood supply of the cerebral cortex. For instance, the region of the cerebral cortex on the medial surface and this little 1 centimeter strip of cortex on the superlateral surface, this is actually supplied by an artery which is known as the anterior cerebral artery. This area has been color coded in red over here. And so if there's a stroke in the anterior cerebral artery, then this part of the cerebral cortex could actually get an infarct, and consequently that could lead to a loss of sensation in the lower limbs, and similarly a motor loss or a paralysis in the lower limb if the primary motor cortex is involved because of the anterior cerebral artery. On the contrary, the region of the cerebral cortex on the superlateral surface over here is supplied by an artery which is known as the middle cerebral artery, as shown over here. The area supplied has been color coded in gray over here. And so if there's a stroke in the middle cerebral artery, then this part of the cerebral cortex could potentially get infarcted and damaged. And consequently, that could lead to a sensory loss in the upper limbs, whereas the lower limbs in this case would be spared. And similarly, a motor loss in the upper limb or a paralysis in the upper limb would be visible by involvement of the middle cerebral artery if it involves the primary motor cortex as well. This kind of information basically helps us to localize a neurological lesion as part of the neurological clinical examination. Right, so to summarize, we have talked about the dorsal column medial leminiscal pathway. The dorsal column carries the sensory information of vibration, proprioception, and two-point discrimination from the peripheral body up to the higher neural centers inside the brain. The sensory fibers in this tract, they travel uncrossed in the posterior columns of the spinal cord. They synapse in their respective nuclei in the caudal medulla, in the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. Then they cross over to the contralateral side as the internal arcuate fibers, and then ascend through the brainstem as a much more ventrally situated structure, where these are known as the medial leminiscus. These are the second order neurons. These then reach eventually the thalamus, where the sensory information is going to be relayed, and the cell bodies of the third order neurons will be situated over here, which are known as the VPL nucleus. These neurons, which are now the thalamocortical projections, the third order neurons, are then going to be projected to the primary sensory cortex, where the conscious perception of that information begins to happen. So, in a nutshell, we've actually taken the pathway through the various horizontal slices, taken at different levels of the CNS, and we've briefly talked about the structural anatomy of each of the horizontal slice as well. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you liked the video. If yes, then please do hit the like button and please do subscribe to my channel. In the next video on the sensory ascending pathways, I'll be talking a little bit in detail about the spinal thalamic pathway, which carries the sensory information of pain and temperature. So, bye for now.